Hello friends and welcome to another session of English literature. So friends, today's topic of discussion is Aristotle's concept of tragedy. So in the previous session I have discussed about Aristotle's concept of tragic hero, and in this session I am going to discuss Aristotle's concept of tragedy along with the characteristics of tragedy as Aristotle mentioned in the Poetics, and of course the qualities of tragic hero according to Aristotle. And apart from these things, in this session I'm going to discuss various parts of tragedies, various types of tragedies, and then the general definition of tragedy. So let's start the session. So at first we have to know that what is tragedy. What is tragedy means the general definition of tragedy. So a tragedy is a genre of drama dealing with some tragic or distressing or terrifying events which has unhappy as well as tragic endings, which also brought down by the hero's own character flaws. So it means that tragedy is a form of drama in which tragic events, distressing events are occurred, and tragedy has unhappy as well as tragic endings. Okay, so the idea of tragedy as a dramatic art or attitude to life came from the ancient Greece to Christian Europe along with Renaissance. In England, the tragic art was transmitted through Seneca. So this was the brief history of tragedy. So you can say that tragedy is a form of drama based on human suffering, dealing with tragic events and having an unhappy ending. Usually, the unhappy ending in a tragedy occurred because of the downfall of the main protagonist or the main hero of that tragedy. So this was the general information about tragedy. And now we have to know that the various parts of tragedy. It means that a tragedy consists of 6 component parts. In a tragedy, we need a plot, then character, thought, diction, melody, and spectacle. And now we have various types of tragedies. So we all know that in English literature, we have to deal with different types of tragedies such as revenge tragedy, Renaissance tragedy, heroic tragedy, sentimental tragedy, and so on, right? Okay, so after this basic information, we have to know about Aristotle's concept on tragedy, or Aristotle's views of tragedy. Okay, so Aristotle actually in his book called Poetics had described a lot of things about tragedy. So the things which he described or which he mentioned in the book Poetics about tragedy, that informations are called Aristotle's concepts on tragedy. Okay, so Aristotle in the book Poetics described that tragedy is therefore an imitation, mimesis of a noble and complete action, which through compassion and fear produces purification of the passions, effecting the proper purgation, catharsis of these emotions. So this quotation is taken from the book Poetics, and this is one of the most important quotations about tragedy. Whenever you are writing something about tragedy, then you have to put these quotations in your answer sheet. Okay, so now let me explain the quotation. Here Aristotle wants to say that tragedy is an imitation of an action. That action through compassion and fear produces purification of the passions of the protagonists, and thus that actions brings a kind of feeling of catharsis upon the mind of the audience. Okay, then in a more descriptive way, Aristotle also defines tragedy as a representation of an action which is important and complete and limited in length. It is enacted, not recited, and by arousing pity and fear, it gives an outlet to emotions of this type. So here, Aristotle wants to say that tragedy is a kind of imitation or a kind of representation of an action, and that action is important as well as complete and not very lengthy. And the most important thing is that that action is enacted, and by arousing pity and fear, that action which is enacted by the protagonist gives a kind of associated emotion. So that's what Aristotle tried to define in Poetics about tragedy. So now we have to know about the characteristics of a tragedy according to Aristotle. So Aristotle in Poetics defines 7 characteristics of a good tragedy, which includes: a tragedy is mimetic, it is serious, it tells the story of an appropriate length, it contains rhythm and harmony. Rhythm and harmony occur in different combinations in different parts of the tragedy, and the tragedy is performed rather than narrated, and that tragedy or the actions in that tragedy arouses pity and fear and thus purges these feelings through catharsis. So now let's explain these characteristics. So at first we have a tragedies mimetic. So here mimetic means a kind of imitation, a kind of transcription. So as I said before that a tragedy is an imitation of an action. So in this case here mimetic means imitation. Then it is serious, it tells the story of an appropriate length. It means that it is not too much lengthy. And a tragedy contains a perfect rhythm that occurs or that we find in different parts of the tragedy. And of course one important thing is that the tragedy purges the feelings of catharsis. Now we have to know that what is catharsis. So Aristotle in Poetics used the word catharsis in the sense that in a tragedy when the tragic hero performs misdeeds and thus when the tragic hero protagonist comes closer to his or her downfall, then the audience thinks that instead of the death of the protagonist, there can be other ways to punish the protagonist for his misdeeds, such as exile instead of death. For example, in the case of Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, we have seen that Oedipus becomes blind, or we can say that Oedipus blinded himself or snatches his eyesight himself. So in the case of Oedipus, instead of death as a kind of punishment, final punishment, we have seen that the another way of punish himself for his misdeed is his blindness. So that's the thing. That means catharsis, that the audience don't want the main protagonist or the main hero to die, okay? So that's the main thing. So these were the basic informations about Aristotle's concept of tragedy. Now we have to know about a bit of Aristotle's concept of tragic hero. So the tragic hero is different from the normal heroes of the normal plays. As Aristotle said in the Poetics that the tragic hero must be neither a villain nor a virtuous character, but a character between the two extremes, yet whose misfortune is brought about not by vice or depravity but by some error or frailty, means hamartia. So here Aristotle wants to say that a tragic hero is both a villain and a virtuous man. So he has both of these characteristics, and his misfortune is brought out or is the result of his own misdeeds. So the misdeeds can be some judgmental error or other types of frailties, okay? So here Aristotle used the word hamartia. So hamartia means that the fall of the character or the fall of the tragic protagonist. So as I said before that the tragic protagonist is both a virtuous man and a villain. So the fall of character is due to his villainous motives. So here villainous motives refers that he is not a kind of bad person, okay? He is not a kind of that much villain because he has some virtue in his character. Here villainous means some bad habits in the character of a person. The bad habits include tragic flaws, excessive pride, these things, okay? And these things like pride, excessive pride, hubris, tragic flaws, these things leads to the downfall of that character. So this is called hamartia. So these were the informations about Aristotle's concept of tragedy as well as tragic hero. So friends, one more thing we have to remember that many playwrights didn't follow the exact characteristics given by Aristotle in Poetics. Many critics and playwrights also opposed Aristotle's views of tragedy. But in each and every tragedy, Aristotle's concepts are followed. So Aristotle's concept of tragedies becomes a kind of theory for tragedy. So it means that if one play or drama belongs to the genre of tragedy, it means that it has some features which Aristotle described in Poetics, okay? So that's it. Thank you so much for watching this video.